We're going to be hearing from Ms. Block about the report of the J. Russell Jennings Joint Committee on Corrections and Juvenile Justice, the oversight to the report is given to the 2025 Kansas Legislature. Without further ado, Ms. Block, it's your committee.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. As stated, I'm Jillian Block with Legislative Research, and I will be presenting the report of the interim committee report of the J. Russell Jennings Joint Committee on Corrections and Juvenile Justice Oversight to the 2025 Kansas Legislature, which I did practice saying. And you should have the report accessible to you at this time. I do have some slides to share with you. It contains the same information as the report. I just find a visual is helpful. After the committee, I will disseminate this, or after the presentation, I will disseminate the presentation to the committee. All right, so a little bit of background about this joint committee. It was established in 1997, entitled the Joint Committee on Corrections and Juvenile Justice Oversight at that time. It is a 14-member legislative joint committee, 7 members from each chamber. The Speaker of the House appoints 2 House members serving on House Appropriations, 2 members serving on House Judiciary, and the Minority Leader appoints 3 House members total, serving some on Appropriations and House Judiciary. It is at their discretion how many on each committee. And then the Senate members are appointed by the Senate President and Senate Minority Leader with proportional representation as outlined by statute. And then in 2023, House Bill 2114 renamed the Joint Committee for former Representative Jennings. There we go. The statutory charges of the committee, to separate it out into 3 broad categories relating to the Department of Corrections, are to monitor the inmate population, to review and study the programs, activities, and plans of the Department of Corrections regarding the department's duties as prescribed by statute for adults, and then to do the same thing regarding the juvenile justice reform and the work of the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee, which is a separate entity, but the Department of Corrections does provide the administrative assistance for the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee, so it is within the Department of Corrections. And then additionally, as it relates to counties, cities, and other local governments, the charge of the Jennings Joint Committee is to review and study adult correctional programs, activities, and facilities of counties, cities, and local governments. And then the same thing for the juvenile offender programs, activities, and facilities of counties, cities, and local governments. And then finally, to make an make an annual report to the Legislative Coordinating Council. So this year, the committee met for 2 full days on November 18th and 19th, on November 18th, hearing presentations on probation, post-release, and parole supervision and the funding mechanisms for those 3, summarized as field supervision when I refer to it later. Heard that the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee, a separate committee, heard that annual report, the same, if not incredibly similar one that you heard from their chairman, Don Heimer, earlier this session, and then overviews of the juvenile community-based services in Johnson County, the Stepping Up initiative from Stephanie Uberall with the Council of State Governments that this committee also heard earlier this session, and then an overview of the Department of Corrections Juvenile Services. The second day of the committee, they heard the Department of Corrections annual report encompassing information including any updates that there were to the Topeka correctional facilities, potential of having a nursery program, for which there was a bill regarding that last year that didn't, I don't remember precisely where it ended, but the like where it ended literally in the committee process, but the end was that it needed to be further studied. And then information about the Hutchinson Correctional Facility and that big line item that's been coming up in appropriations the past year and a half in conversations. Here, the committee also heard the Kansas Sentencing Commission's annual report, and then information from a judge in, I forget which district, so I'm not going to state because I don't want to misstate, but that is in the report about the juvenile offender registration current practices. So if a juvenile is sentenced to an offender registry, like the current practices when a judge uses their discretion and when that a judge may order that or may not. And then they left time for their discussion and recommendations. So the third day of committee was not a meeting, as a quorum was not present, and it's only important to emphasize that just to clarify that there was no violation of COMA in this circumstance. But the members were invited to Johnson County to tour some of their juvenile facilities that they have. And so this included the Adolescent Center for Treatment, which is a substance use treatment center. This is something that is open to juveniles all over Kansas. And I double-checked my notes and then forgot it by the time I came up here. I believe this is something that they can be, it's part of their sentencing that a judge can send them to. We saw the committee was invited to tour both of their juvenile intake and assessment centers. They have one that is attached to their juvenile detention center, and then they have a separate one that is attached to their ACT Center and their Youth Crisis Stabilization Center. The committee got to see the Youth Crisis Stabilization Center, which is kind of a respite care, not quite a juvenile crisis intervention center, which is another term that's come up several times in committee. And then finally, the committee also got to tour the Juvenile Detention Center. You won't find information on this in the report because it was not a meeting, but the committee did get to tour this. And so if you have questions about it, I was present at the tour. We didn't formally take attendance, but I did see a little wave of a committee member who was present who may also be eager to answer questions in the tour. It was in Johnson County, and this particular representative, should they choose to make themselves known to the rest of the committee, is also from Johnson County. So the committee had several recommendations. It's Mr. Vice Chair. Okay. Before I jump over to the committee recommendations, Mr. Chair, would you like me to pause for questions or shall I carry on? Perfect. To split them up into two different categories, there were agency recommendations, some of which were the Kansas Sentencing Commission. The committee requested that the Kansas Sentencing Commission include data on the success of the Senate Bill 123 and 123 Plus and Recovery from Addiction-Funded Treatment RAFT diversion program in their next annual report. You may remember we passed out of committee a bill number that escapes me right now, but that amended some of the sentencing conditions to which a person can be sentenced to these diversion programs. And the questions came up in committee, what is the recidivism rates for this? How successful are they? And so that's just information that they were able to get for the committee, and it's just requested that they have that in their next report. And then another request is to review the current sentencing guidelines and make recommendation to the legislature as appropriate. It's been some time since the sentencing grid has been reviewed, and so that was just a recommendation that the Sentencing Commission just review it all and make recommendations to the legislature. And then a direct recommendation for the Department of Corrections was to continue to study opening a nursery at the Topeka Correctional Facility, which if the Topeka Correctional Facility doesn't ring any bells for you immediately, that is the Women's Correctional Facility that is here in Topeka. As I cited earlier, there was a bill about it last year that they decided to form a work group that I have not heard any update on lately. I'm certain we could ask and get some information if we're curious about it, but they're just very early stages on what would this look like if we wanted to do something. So then legislative recommendations. So these three are the funding related ones. To consider increasing reimbursement rates for the diversion programs, as referenced earlier. Something that was heard in testimony is that it can be hard to find providers as the reimbursement rates are pretty low and not competitive. It's recommended or requested that the Joint Committee on State Building Construction consider funding the replacement of the Hutchinson Correctional Facility, and then consider legislation that funds enhancements to increase mental health services. Another typo. Come on, Jillian. So then the non-funding related recommendations. The Senate recommends that the Senate Committee on Judiciary and the House Committee on Corrections and Juvenile Justice hold informational hearings on the provisions regarding juvenile offenders in the Kansas Offender Registration Act. So this is in direct response to what was heard from Judge Delia York that second day in committee, just to see really the question being, is it still reflecting what is believed to be best practices? Is there really a more accurate way to capture it, given where the judges are using their discretion? There are a couple instances where the judges have no discretion. Could they be given discretion? There were just questions that came up. And so the recommendation from the committee was that simply informational hearings be held. And then the committee recommends to consider legislation to increase the state match from 25% to 50% for the Lansing Career Institute, which we did, and that did get passed out of committee. And then to request an interim study in 2025 to study in-depth the plausibility of creating a Department of Offender Supervision to combine court services, community corrections, and parole. So this was in response to the first morning of the committee work, where we heard about the field supervision. I believe tomorrow we will be hearing from the president of the Kansas Community Corrections Association. So at risk of stealing too much of his thunder, community corrections is funded by the counties, and their funding mechanism is the most different than the other two correction agencies, and that's something that the Joint Committee has been kind of hearing about for the past few years as part of their supervisory role. And so it's become a question that, would it be better to combine them? And so the committee requests an interim study this year, and calling it an interim study and not a committee so that it can be closer to a task force that could bring all of these players to the table instead of only a legislative committee to really explore this. And then finally, the committee recommends the Senate Committee on Judiciary and House Committee on Corrections and Juvenile Justice review the statutory requirements and future funding of the evidence-based program account to consider if changes are needed to ensure access to these funds by more youth-related organizations. The evidence-based programs account, you might recall, is the grant is the account that is funded by the money saved by Senate Bill 367 that is disseminated in grants that the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee, the other committee, advises the Department of Corrections. These are the grants that ought to be disseminated, and the Department of Corrections disseminates those grants. And so the question is that standard of evidence-based too high? Is the money getting out to the community where it needs to go? Or do we need to talk about maybe making that standard a little less so that the money can get to where it is so that the juveniles can be helped where they need to be helped? And consider if changes are needed to ensure that the funds are available to more youth-related organizations. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'd be delighted to stand for questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Block. I'll open questions by the committee. Representative Smith.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Increase the match from 25 to 50%. Does the county, wherever the young person comes from, pay the other 50% or 75%? So it's the county's responsibility.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Smith. So this was for specifically the public-private partnership. This was the bill. I'm going to look over to my colleagues at the table to see if they can get that number for me, that we passed out of committee, the public-private partnership that isn't going to increase any appropriations. It was just increasing that state matching from the whatever match it was to that one-to-one match.
Yeah, I carried that bill. I apologize. And then secondly, Forgive me for asking this, but the kids that are in the correctional facility, are they in individual cells?
Are you referring to Johnson County?
Yes.
Thank you for asking. It's House Bill 2215. Thank you, Jordan. The ones that are in the detention center, if I recall correctly, no, they're in partnered cells. They do have different wings, is how they managed if there was an equivalent of like a maximum and a minimum security. Those weren't the terms that they used. And so they were in partnered cells if they needed someone who was in a higher risk. They did have an empty cell that they just didn't have the need for anymore, that if they needed to isolate someone, they had options to do that. But I don't recall seeing any of them in like actual isolation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Are there any other questions from the committee? Oh, you guys are, okay, good.
Tell me more about the evidence-based program account, how much money is in it, and what can it be used for?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Minority Member. That is a great question that I will get with our fiscal analyst, Nicole Hrencher, who works with the Department of Corrections budget, and I'll see if I can get you those numbers.
Right. Don't see any further questions, so thank you, Ms. Block.
Of course.
Is there, we're at the end of our session today, unless somebody on the committee wants to talk about anything. Sure. Representative Lingens.
I just wanted to, I discovered this in our packet a while back and hadn't really read it. It's called the Missouri model. I think it's in our S drive somewhere. I don't know why it would have been printed out by my office assistant, if not. And it's a very interesting model, and you can go online and download their annual report from 2023 that I sent to the chairman to see what they're doing in Missouri and what kind of success rates they're having with in their Department of Juvenile Services. They have like a success rate of between 75 and 77% non-recidivation, and it's broken down in categories of offenses. So you can look and see, you know, how those who are there on felonies are doing compared to, you know, those who are there for misdemeanors or mental health or other reasons. It's just kind of interesting, and I just thought it's worthwhile, you know, as we head into next week, that we at least look at this and kind of familiarize ourselves with maybe other things out there that we might run into, because I know someone handed it out, but I don't remember it being referenced, so I just thought I'd call your attention to it.
Yes, I have had a chance to look at that this morning, and I do think it's worth a read. Representative Smith.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Can I ask you another question? If a young man, say a young man's in there and he turns 18, do they send him out of the youth facility, or do they leave him there?
Representative, I'm sorry, Ms. Block, you can respond if you know.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative, I don't know that. I'm not sure for juvenile detention centers. I know we've heard that answer regarding if they're in like the juvenile, the complex, but we can certainly dig into that and get information to you.
Any further questions? If not, we're adjourned.
Thank you.